body and grinding down the center.
Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Rincón Rojo magazine. The Mexican champion Maribel Ramirez will face Argentine Clara Lescuratt on June 24th for the WBA.
It was for the WBA Super Flyweight title in the Super Flyweight division.
This is part of a festival, a function that the WBA is actually holding in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Knockout drugs.
They've got a card going down on Thursday that Jarrell Miller's supposed to be a part of, and one on Friday.
This card is supposed to go down on Friday. Maribel Ramirez, who sports a professional record of 13 wins, 9 losses with 3 draws, will be taking on unbeaten Clara Lescuratt, who sports a professional record of just 6 wins, no losses, and no draws with 3 knockouts. Maribel Ramirez is quite far from being this division's apex predator, in spite of being its longest reigning champion.
There are 4 champions at Super Flyweight, and Maribel Ramirez is the longest reigning champion among them.
Though, as stated, Maribel Ramirez is quite far from being this division's apex predator. If anything, she's the weakest link, the weakest champion, in my opinion, the champion in the most danger of being unseated.
Apex predator would have to go to her countrywoman, Lourdes Juarez.
Lourdes Juarez of Mexico, Maribel Ramirez's countrywoman. I'd have to say that Lourdes has the look of this division's apex predator to me, having reigned as this division's WBC champion since December of 2020.
Maribel is the weakest link, and Maribel's going to be in action this Friday.
Maribel Ramirez, who is a year older than Clara Lescuratt. Maribel Ramirez, the champion. Clara, the challenger.
Challenger from Argentina, where this fight is taking place.
I mean, if anybody's got home field advantage here, it would be the challenger, not the champion.
We know Clara Lescuratt has been a lot busier than Maribel in the last 12 months.
Clara Lescuratt, the challenger of Argentina, debuted as a professional just last year, and since last year, she's already fought 6 times, whereas Maribel, the champion, she's been a lot less active in the last 12 months. She's only fought once.
Maribel Ramirez, the reigning champion, in all actuality, has only fought once in the last 2 or 3 years.
She sat out all of 2019, 2020, and 2021. She sat out all of last year, only returning to action earlier this year in April against Chile's own Daniela Asenjo, who she fought to a draw.
How she's been able to hang on to that WBA title being so sparsely active is beyond me.
The WBA couldn't have been ordering her to fight any mandatory challengers between 2019 and earlier this year.
It couldn't have been. She sat out all of 2019, 2020, and 2021.
By all rights, Maribel Ramirez shouldn't even be reigning as a champion right now, having literally, quite literally, not fought in 3 consecutive years throughout her reign as a champion. But here she is, and she's going to be defending her title this Friday against what, at least to me, appears to be a more ambitious fighter in Clara Lescuratt, who has been busy.
I'd wager, because Clara has been fighting a lot more often in the last 12 months than Maribel.
I'd wager she's going to be a little sharper the night of the fight. I don't want to make any bold proclamations, but what I will say is that I wouldn't be surprised if the title ends up changing hands this Friday, and in many ways it needs to, as the women's super flyweight division is a division that's mostly overlooked. It's a ho-hum division that desperately needs a shot in the arm, desperately needs some fresh faces and some new blood.
These champions don't appear to be trying to unify with each other.
Japan's own Tamao Ozawa, reigning WBO champion, well, she just won her belt, but Macielo Lujan, Lourdes Juarez, and Maribel Ramirez, what attempts have they made to take on the other titleists at this weight? Near as I can tell, this is a division that's full of girls that are happy to stay away from each other.
And that doesn't help this division's profile at all. That's why it's not getting the same attention as, say, the bantamweight division,
where you hear more talk of unification matches than what you hear in reference to the super flyweight division. That's why this division doesn't have the same profile as the women's super featherweight division, the lightweight division, or the super lightweight division, so on and so forth. It doesn't help this division's profile at all. That all these champions seem happy to stay away from each other.
How's anybody supposed to stand out?
Now, I don't want to make bold proclamations or jump to conclusions, but I will say that I wouldn't be at all surprised to hear that the title ends up changing hands this weekend on Friday in Buenos Aires, because Maribel Ramirez, at least to me, is the weakest link, the weakest champion among the 4 champions in the super flyweight division, and I happen to think Clara Lescuratt is a more inspired fighter, she might be, than Maribel Ramirez is at this point. It's a situation I'm going to monitor, and we'll see what happens. Now, in reference to that festival being held in Buenos Aires by way of the WBA, Jarrell Miller's supposed to fight on Thursday.
The WBA's KO to Drugs Festival in Argentina.
Jarrell Big Baby Miller, who's still undefeated, by the way, will fight in a professional boxing match for the first time in nearly 4 years Thursday when the heavyweight contender takes on journeyman Ariel Esteban Bracamonte of Argentina at the casino in Buenos Aires. Miller, who sports a professional record of 23 wins, no losses, with 1 draw and 20 knockouts, has been inactive since November of 2018 due to a string of drug test failures. The brash Brooklyn-based Miller blew his shot at the heavyweight titles in 2019 when he tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs weeks prior to his announced fight with Anthony Joshua.
Although he got off with a slap on the wrist that time.
It costed him the Anthony Joshua fight, it did, but he subsequently entered a partnership with Top Rank, and ahead of what was supposed to be his Top Rank debut, he tested positive for more banned substances.
That was in June of 2020.
He was supposed to be fighting Jerry Forrest. Jarrell Miller said the failed test was caused by a sexual performance pill he'd been using. The Nevada State Athletic Commission suspended Miller till June of this year, and the boxer was eligible for a license beginning June 17th only if he continued producing negative drug tests through VADA's clean boxing program.
Telling me this guy's been out of action for 4 years because he was taking dick pills.
Stories get stranger and stranger the more of them you sift through. Tyson Fury's positive nandrolone test was as a result of him eating boar testicles. Luis Ortiz was so hungry he ate a horse.
That's what he said way back when in 2014 when he tested positive for nandrolone.
Apparently, Jarrell Miller was experiencing performance issues in the bedroom, so he sought some...
What's more embarrassing, if he's lying about all of this or if he's telling the truth?
And out of all the stories you could cook up, this is the best you could do. Jarrell Miller was slated to fight on a Triller Fight Club show on June 25th, but those plans were ultimately scrapped, if you can believe that as well. The Triller is still trying to carve out a lane for themselves in the sport of boxing after having lost the rights to the Teofimo Lopez versus George Cambosos fight and saying they were going to sue the IBF.
They weren't happy that the IBF found them in default.
In order to participate in those purse bids by way of these alphabet organizations, you're required to make a deposit. Triller made a deposit, a little over $1 million, and they lost that money as a result of being found in default.
They were found in default by way of the IBF for the fight having not happened by the deadline.
The rights to the fight ended up going to Matchroom, and the rest, as they say, is history. Better still, I know of no lawsuit that Triller actually filed against the IBF. I don't know where we are with that, if we're anywhere. And that's where Jarrell Miller was supposed to be fighting.
Supposed to be fighting on Triller, but those plans got scrapped.
The last time Jarrell Miller fought was in November 17th, 2018, when he knocked out Bogdan Dinu inside 4 rounds. Miller has also tested positive for a banned substance during his days as a professional kickboxer. In 2014, Jarrell Miller has a long history with banned substances and performance-enhancing drugs. In recent months, Miller has served as a sparring partner for Tyson Fury and has linked up to train with Kevin Cunningham. The 29-year-old Bracamonte
sports a professional record of 11 wins, 7 losses with 6 knockouts.
He's coming off a decision loss to Dempsey McKean. Dempsey McKean, who is a matchroom fighter. He's going to be in action very soon in Australia.
Bracamonte lost the decision to Dempsey back in February.
He's going to be facing Jarrell Miller this Thursday. What do I think about this? I won't bore you with the moral authority, the moral high horse that a lot of people take when it comes to performance-enhancing drugs, banned substances in the sport of boxing, as the sport itself seems to have a lot of moral ambiguity.
A lot of people like to get on a moral high horse when it comes to this subject, but the sport itself seems quite ambiguous.
What's the appropriate punishment for a guy like Jarrell Miller? What's the appropriate punishment for a guy like Jean Pascal, who, like Jarrell Miller, tested positive for several banned substances, and very recently he returned to action on Pro Box.
Took on unbeaten Chinese light heavyweight Meng Feng Long.
Jean Pascal won the fight. Jean Pascal, like Jarrell Miller, he tested positive for several banned substances. So what's the appropriate punishment for a fighter in that situation? What, are you supposed to get a certain amount of years away from the sport based on the number of banned substances they find in your system? Or
Are people blowing this out of proportion?
not an easy subject to broach in what already is a very dangerous sport.
And that's why this is frowned upon in so many circles, though behind the curtain.
And behind the scenes, you really have to wonder what's really going on. How many more fighters aren't on banned substances, just like Jarrell Miller, with the difference being that they haven't been caught? They might have chosen to make an example out of Jarrell.
Oh yeah, they made an example out of him, but there might be that many more guys just like him.
He certainly isn't the only guy that's tested positive for banned substances in the last 4 years. Avni Yildirim, John Pascal.
He's not the only guy who got popped 2 times.
Lucas Brown of Australia, who was very recently in action against Junior Fa on the undercard of Kambosos versus Haney. He tested positive for banned substances on 2 separate occasions, as did Luis Ortiz, who's supposed to be returning to action against Andy Ruiz in September.
The real question here is, what major promotional outfit's going to do business with Jarrell Miller moving forward?
Even if he wins on Thursday, keeps his unbeaten record, who's going to want to do any kind of business with him? He burnt bridges with Matchroom. He burnt bridges with Top Rank. I don't get the sense he'll go back to the PBC.
Well, if he did, they'd have a number of potential opponent options there for him.
If that's how the cookie crumbles, though it might not crumble quite that way, as any major promotional outfit has a deal with any major network would appear complicit with Jarrell Miller's behaviors.
They'd appear complicit with his transgressions. They'd appear complicit with his use of banned substances.
What happens behind the scenes is behind the scenes, but if you're actually signing a guy to some kind of a multi-fight deal, a promotional pact, well, that's not behind the scenes. That's out in the open, and if you do that, you will appear complicit with Jarrell Miller's behaviors.
Maybe he can sign to Pro Bellum. They're still doing shows.
They don't have a network broadcast partner, you understand, but they are still doing shows. Pretty low on the radar, but they're doing them.
Hey, John Pascal was in action a little over a week ago on Pro Box.
The Meng Feng Long fight I talked about earlier. They're the ones hosting that Gonzalez versus Barriga fight later on this week on Friday.
For Gonzalez's WBO Junior Flyweight World title.
Beyond this Thursday's fight, maybe Jarrell Miller can see about fighting on that platform, at least for the time being, because I don't think either Matchroom or Top Rank are going to touch him.
Got to ease himself back into activity as best as he can.
And he hasn't made it easy for himself in many ways. He painted himself into a corner.
Now he's got to get out of it.
And finally, in men's super middleweight news, you may have heard already, the official venue for Canelo versus Golovkin 3 has been confirmed. It will be landing at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, the site of the first 2 fights.
You still got people trying to poo-poo all over this thing.
Trying to convince themselves and others that this trilogy isn't a major fight, a major event in the sport of boxing that won't draw major attention. Coincidentally, these are the same people that watched Deontay Wilder get his ass kicked by Tyson Fury.
They watched that guy get his ass kicked in one-sided fashion and still demanded that there be a third fight.
It's the same fucking people.
They were all for that trilogy. They're not so high on this one.
Even though the first 2 Canelo versus Golovkin fights were a lot more competitive comparatively than the first 2 Wilder versus Fury fights.
Comparatively, yeah. Nobody got knocked down. Nobody got knocked out.
They're still trying to poo-poo all over this thing and convince themselves and others that this isn't a major fight, that people don't want to see this. Content creators here on YouTube are still running their anti-Canelo, anti-Golovkin, anti-Eddie Hearn, anti-DAZN propaganda,
which may do wonders for their channel's metrics, though in the real world,
where real paying customers pay real money to see real fights with real fighters, real champions, well,
in the real world, all that anti-DAZN stuff means very little.
All that anti-Canelo, he was never good anyway kind of stuff means very little to the actual paying public that pays actual money to see this guy fight. They're going to be locked in.
Because these guys that make those kinds of videos that cater to that anti-Canelo audience.
Yeah, there's a high abundance of those kinds of guys here on YouTube where you can watch stuff for free, but when it's time to pull out your wallet and actually pay the piper, where are these people to support the fighters they do like? The fighters like Errol Spence Jr.,
Yeah.
the fighters like Gervonta Davis. Gervonta, who's been on pay-per-view 4 times. He still can't crack 300,000 buys. Errol Spence Jr.'s last fight didn't crack 300,000 buys.
Where are these people?
I'll tell you where they are. They're sat at home illegally streaming fights. That's where they are. I told you.
You can find a high abundance of these mouth breathers on social media, on Twitter, on YouTube.
Social media sites that are basically free. You can find a proliferation of these kinds of guys, these kinds of girls on social media, but where you can't find them is in the actual metrics for a fight because they're not paying customers.
Who fucking cares what you think about boxing? You're not gonna buy the fight anyway.
Even if it does involve a fighter you claim to like. This fight is a major event in the sport of boxing, make no mistake. It's a trilogy that seems long overdue. Perhaps it should have happened sooner, though it's here. And it's set to go down September 17th at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas.
Matchroom and DAZN are announcing a lot of big fights and a lot of big news.
Earlier today, they held the kickoff press conference for the Anthony Joshua versus Alexander Usyk rematch, which is set to go down the month before this fight. Joshua versus Usyk 2 is happening in August. Canelo versus Golovkin 3 is happening in September.
You really got people trying to convince themselves these aren't major fights, even when there are $80 million site fees.
These guys are too easy to peg, and they really think they're blotting out the sun by holding their index finger in the sky. The rest of us can see the truth. The rest of us can see the light. Just fine. It's only you.
You guys are the only bozos that believes any of that bullshit they're saying.
You think Saudi Arabian investors are going to put up $80 million of their own dollars to ensure they can host this fight between Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk because DAZN is a failing platform?
A platform that hosts fights that nobody watches. Am I understanding this?
Because that is how American-based promotional outfits, American-based promoters Bob Arum and Leonard Ellerbe choose to tell the story.
Oh, really? So how many $80 million fights are you two guys doing this year?
Hey, which one of your fighters draws more in America than Canelo Alvarez? Clue me in.
This level of cognitive dissonance borders on a disorder.
Addressing the fight itself, well, won't be as hard on an aging Gennady Golovkin to make the weight for this fight. Perhaps he might arrive invigorated to super middleweight, 168 pounds, having not had to cut the extra 8 pounds he'd need to cut to make middleweight. There's that to consider, though. Canelo Alvarez is a fighter who has never been dropped, has never been stopped. Not even at light heavyweight. Not even in his last fight, which he so clearly lost.
Still never been dropped, still never been stopped. So durability's gotta go to him.
It has to. Even if not having to cut that extra 8 pounds that Golovkin normally has to cut to make weight. Even if that results in him being a little bit more durable. Perhaps even a little bit more refreshed.
The word is out on his Achilles heel, and the word has been out for some time now. He's weak to the body.
Saw that in the Golovkin versus Sergey Gidivyanchenko fight. We saw that in the Ryota Murata fight more recently. Couple of body shots that Ryota Murata put down there. We saw that Golovkin can be hurt. He can take the head punches. He can take those punches just fine. It's the body punches.
Everybody knows he's weak to the body.
Even though Canelo Alvarez's power was unable to avail him against a light heavyweight.
Yeah, he couldn't put a dent in Dmitry Bivol.
An unbeaten light heavyweight in his prime, I'd wager he can put a dent in today's Gennady Golovkin.
Look for this in September.